just want to sort of lead off with saying a big thank you. I am so glad to have everyone here today. It is October, which is actually Dyslexia Awareness Month, and we're here today to talk about dyslexia in focus and really the idea of empowering change. And my name is Jamie Williamson. I'm the head of school here at the Windward School. I'm also the executive director of the Windward Institute, and there's a few really fun things that I get to do in my job on a day-to-day basis. One is I get to spend some time in classrooms with incredible kids, learning and watching them grow and learn and sort of find their power under the work of our program. But two, sometimes I get to have some conversations with some really, really incredible people via webinar or in professional meetings, and today is no different. So I am really excited actually to bring you a wonderful panel discussion with some people who have become quickly big favorites in my world here. So I'd love to start off by introducing Margie Booth here, who is the co-chair of the board of the National Center for Learning Disabilities. And she's been working with that organization for almost 20 years. And so I think she's going to really bring a really rich context and flavor for the work. In her sort of personal space, she also does and leads a group called In Booth, and which is a marketing communications firm, and has done some has a big client list, some really impressive clients. But most importantly, I think about Margie is actually she's a Windward alumni parent. So I think she's got a lot of hats she gets to wear, and I'm so happy to have you part of this conversation today. Next up, we're going to continue the Windward theme here, I think, which is really important. We have Bobby Carroll, who is a New York State Assemblyman in the 44th District, and also a Windward alumni. So very, very happy to have Bobby here. Bobby is a fierce advocate for our students and for legislative priorities that relate to dyslexia. He's had the opportunity to bring several bills up in the House, the Assembly in New York, from the Task Force Act to the Dyslexia Diagnosis Act, which will really mandate, private health insurance policies to pay for neuropsychs for kids, which is really exciting. In addition to the New York IDA Act, and several others, and also introducing the Right to Read Act in New York State. So again, Bobby, thank you so much for being here. It's been great to see the passion you have for our kids, our work, but also Windward in general. So much appreciated. And then certainly last, but in no way least here, we have Jackie Rodriguez, who is the current CEO of, and the new CEO of NCLD, which we're really, really excited to have here today, because I think that your background is actually so fascinating and interesting, especially for this conversation today. So prior to joining NCLD, you spent some time at the American Association of Colleges for Teacher Education, as well as the Vice President for Research and Policy and Advocacy. And you've done a lot of great research and professional programs, but you were also a teacher. And so I think that's, sometimes I feel like in some of these spaces, I think having that sort of that anchor from a classroom perspective as we're doing some of this work is such a great sort of space to kind of come at this. She's also done some writing in her work, and wrote a book called Special Education Law and Policy from Foundation to Application. So again, I think we've assembled a really incredible sort of panel here, and just want to say a sincere thank you to all three of you for being here today and spending your time, your energy, and certainly sharing some of your knowledge base with our community, and I think in celebration of some of the great work that's happening in our state, in our country. There have been some exciting times to be in this work, and there's been some Sisyphean times, right, where we're really pushing the boulder up the hill. It's hard to see how much further we've got or how much progress we've even made sometimes. But I do think that, there's still some ways to go. But we're in a space now where we're really seeing, if you look at the NAEP data, almost a little over a third of our students in fourth grade are not reading at a basic level. We have, those kids we know are going to have lifetime earning issue, higher rates of unemployment, higher likelihood to enter the criminal justice system. And if you're a Black and brown student, the impact of that is even greater in your sort of, your sort of trajectory there. But as I said, not all is dark and bright, and there's some bright spots along the way here. And I have to tell you, right now, I don't know if you're feeling this, but I'm feeling some real excitement in the field. When you see some of the conversations happening at the state level, you recognize that we've had 32 states and the District of Columbia pass laws or implemented policies around of evidence-based reading instruction. That's an incredible feat, which is why part of the reason we're really excited to have Bobby here in the conversation today. We've seen turnaround is probably the wrong way to describe it. It is the sea change in states like Mississippi, where after doing where these reading scores jumped by 10 points between 2013 and 2019 for just mandating training for teachers and scientifically based reading instruction. You're seeing Colorado has leaned really hard into teacher preparation and issuing new standards for elementary school teachers. And so in Colorado's really kind of moved up in their space in the kind of national pecking order when it comes to teacher prep. So there's a lot of good things happening in the world, but I still think we've got a long ways to go. And this work is really important for the both for the health of our students and on their individual side of things, but also just in terms of the world at large here. I think we are a stronger country when our kids and our the foundational sort of platform for kids learning to read and be good comprehenders and really good sort of creative content as they move through the world. This just raises all boats, right? So I've got a big question. Some of the questions I'm really going to try to direct at individual folks, and I hope you can appreciate that because I know that you've got some expertise in the area, and I'd really like to tap into that. And then some questions we're going to throw out to the group to see, just to kind of gain some understanding of your perspective on this. So as we start off here, I'd love to kind of kick this up to folks to really talk about how would you describe the state of education right now for students with dyslexia and other language-based learning disabilities? Feel free to jump right in.
All right, well, I'll throw the ball out, and then hopefully Margie and Bobby can take it from there. Interestingly, I was going to lead with, not much has changed. And yet, I think you're right in that we're in a unique space with regard to the public perception of what it means to have dyslexia. And I think there is not just a sea change with legislative and policy initiatives, but also in practice. Parents are becoming more aware of what services should be provided, what accommodations should be in place, and they're advocating as fiercely as they have been since the 60s and the 70s when we first had students become, I wouldn't even call included, but presented on school campuses. So, we can all relay the data, 80% of time spent in general ed classrooms for kids with LD. That's awesome. In 2010, when Obama said in front of a signing ceremony that students in special education are all of our students, they're everybody's kids, I think that was a pivotal point for public educators. Withstanding that, though, I think we still need to talk about the fact that there are lots of different kinds of learning disabilities. And while we are focused so much on dyslexia right now, there are lots of kids right now with dysgraphia and dyspraxia, and et cetera, that aren't seeing the same types of evidence-based interventions being put into schools with efficacy and with rigor. And so we as a community have, the old adage around the rising tide lifting all boats. We really need to not just focus on one particular area of LD, but remind all teachers and educators that there are a variety of things going on in schools and classrooms, and to not forget about the fact that sequencing and the fact that word problems exist in math really do need to be attended to by all educators. Yeah, so I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, as a parent, I still think of us and them. And by that, I mean, if we're lucky enough to be educated and know how to access those resources and how to tap into, how to get tested, we are so lucky. But there are still so many people that even if we have these services, they don't know how to tap into them. They don't even understand. I just had somebody the other day tell me about their child. They had no idea how to help their child. And this was somebody that supposedly was educated. So think of the people that just aren't. And I still worry greatly about that and how we solve that problem.
Thank you so much. I think it's such an important point.
I couldn't agree more with what Margie just said. And though, we may have seen a kind of from 36,000 feet, finally this conversation come to newspapers and television and policymakers, I still think on the ground, especially in New York, there is a long way to go. New York State is one of the few states now left in the nation that doesn't have specific statewide policy directed towards children struggling with dyslexia or other language-based learning disorders. And in New York City, where I have commended and stood with Mayor Adams and Chancellor David Banks as they've tried to right the ship in New York City, very many of their changes are really general education changes. They're changes about evidence-based curriculum for the average student. And though I commend that, and I think we should be having good pedagogy and teacher training for all of our students, I think drilling down and making sure students who are struggling with dyslexia or other learning-based language disorders really deserve extra special attention, because too often I think those students have been used as a canary in the coal mine to change policies, but then that the policies that are changed really are for other students. And so these children deserve advocates. You shouldn't have to hire a lawyer or be deeply educated or be well-resourced to have your child learn how to read. And we know that the vast majority of children struggling with dyslexia and other issues can become fluent and fluent readers.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. I want to come back to a point Jackie had made on this idea of the public perception has been the biggest sort of change here. I think you're absolutely right. I think there's so many spaces where it's on the radar and the kind of the forefront of the public mind, far more than it's ever been. I recently saw Tiffany Hogan, who's been a great friend of our program. She's a researcher, brilliant researcher. We absolutely love Tiffany and the work that she's doing. But she talked about this idea of the implementation side of this, right? So you have all this research happening and this public policy shifting, and there's been such a disconnect between how you translate that into the classroom. And so often we think, oh, this intervention has a high effect size, this will be great for kids, but without understanding the context with which that intervention was tested, if you don't sort of match conditions there, you're like, it's not going to end up being an effective space intervention in that space. And so like linking that idea of practice and sort of pulling the the policy to actually implementation side of that, I think helps us move beyond that. But I think we've still got a long way to go from we're starting to change hearts and minds, which is step one, recognizing of the problem. But I think that getting to that next phase is going to be big. And Margie and Bobby both, I so appreciate your sort of focus on how challenging the parent journey is on this. Because in all things these days, we have so much information and often quite times misinformation as we move through these things. And and you're right, like we have so many families who have great resource, who have such a hard time figuring out how to navigate a system that is quite opaque in its process here, where folks will use every excuse under the sun to go from to not serve a child or to not do what's right. And then I think about families who don't have the resource to kind of show up in the way that some of our families get a chance to, how even more exponentially difficult that conversation is for them. So we still have a lot of work to do, still got a lot of things to kind of unfurl and really think through. And at this point, sometimes I was talking to someone the other day, like in my work, sometimes I used to think I love problems. I've always loved problem solving. It's one of the things I just really love to chew on a really meaty problem and sort of think about how do we solve something. But actually this work and the work at sort of at the level that I get to sort of spend my time in, it's no longer problem solving. It's actually dilemma oriented, right? So when things get up to this level, it's not a problem anymore. It's a dilemma, and it's a deep dilemma that we have to really put some thoughtfulness, some intentionality in, and really come to the table to really think about things in new and creative and interesting ways to help move something forward. So, so Margie, I'd love your sort of experience working at NCLD and seeing that's an organization that I've always had like a deep admiration for in the work that they're doing. And so I'd love to have you sort of reflect just a little bit about over your time on the NCLD board, what are some like one or two of the things that you really feel like you've seen some big successes that kind of stand out to you along the way?
I really had to reflect on this question a lot because, here we are 20 years later, and I'm thinking, as Jackie said, what has changed?
Yeah,
but
yeah.
I think one of the things that has changed is that the way we talk about and think about and don't clump together reading and dyslexia. And so one of the big pivotal changes has been that people now are able to discern a little bit more, the difference between dyslexia and ADHD, the dysgraphia, all of those kinds of things. So that was one thing that was very pivotal. The other thing, and this is just in recent years, is that young adults are now beginning to advocate for themselves. And so we see this in a lot of different ways. NCLD has a great young adult council. They literally, there are 30 of them, they go up to the Hill and advocate on behalf of themselves and on the laws they want to see passed, which is great. And then if you look online, there are actually influencer groups that are young adults that are talking about all of these issues all the time and advocating for them. So just seeing young adults take hold of it and really advocate for themselves is a really big change.
Thank you. I so appreciate that. When we think about sort of NCLD and kind of the 4 pillars that you're sort of working in here, the idea of fueling this disabilities rights movement, investing in bright futures, championing research and understanding, and supporting equitable policies. And maybe this is for Jackie or for Margie, either one who wants to take a kind of a shot at this one. Which of these pillars do you think has had the greatest progress in your time?
Oh, so if you qualify it as in the last 9 months of my tenure at NCLD, to be perfectly frank, I think they're interrelated. I don't know that I can elevate one in particular as being more or less important or having priority. I do think that, to your earlier comment, the research has to get translated into practice.
Yeah.
We can't just look at conditional situations and apply them in mass. We have to be able to understand what it means in a classroom to provide evidence-based interventions and know that those interventions have viability for the particular students we're working with. And so I do think NCLD is not just an advocate, but even we're starting our own original research now around where state of LD is in classrooms. I'll just mention that in the past several years under Lindsay Jones and Sheldon Horowitz, who were prior to my tenure, but deep friends and colleagues, we've produced the State of LD report several times. We're actually launching now a longitudinal study that will match 1,000 nationally representative general and special educators, as well as young adults who have learning disabilities. And we're going to inquire with them not only about their experiences in the K-12 environment, but also what's it like to see post-secondary outcomes? Are they employed? Are they thriving? And then we're going to track them over the course of the next several years. And I bring it up because I think it's not just important to take these snippets of information and then apply as though that is the steadfast rule, but rather, what does it look like over time to be supporting our constituents and our beneficiaries? And how can we ensure that that level of support is not only steadfast, but it shifts when the need is different? And so that's something that I think the NCLD contribution to the field will look like toward the future.
Yeah. Thank you. I don't know, Margie, if you have anything else to add to that at all?
I'll let it be. She's a great spokesperson for us.
She very much is. So, I want to sort of, I think pull on a little string here. So the idea of the translational science thing and the coordination. So you have so many things that need to work together for this to work. And I think that if you only focus on the research, you can get a little lost. If you only focus on teacher training, you can get a little lost. If you only focus on student outcomes, you can get a little lost. And really the coordination of these translational sort of pieces here and having a clear window from the classroom to the research bench, and whatever sort of dynamic that holds, to the policymakers that need to be thinking about the things that our kids and families need to in order to be successful in the work here. I do think that though that coordination has been so missing, and it's been so wonderful to see some folks really start to kind of bring some of that ideas into light. I cannot wait to see that report and the longitudinal impact of this work, because I think that now that we have some AI tools sometimes to kind of help us think about some of the big data pieces that can really pull out some insight that maybe we as mere human thinkers can sort of we might miss a little bit. But I'm excited to see how some of that larger data set might actually provide some real insight to how the impact of educational practices or lack thereof. So I cannot wait to see that. I also maybe want to take a little moment here, Bobby, to kind of think just a little about some of the structures that need to be strengthened and put into place in order to kind of help support individuals with dyslexia. And I know you have been doing some really, really big work on this. So talking about the importance of screeners and evaluations and the access to those. But what do you think are some current barriers for students and families to receive the diagnosis or the eligibility piece that they really desperately need in order to kind of move forward? And what are some solutions do you think we could put out to help move that along?
Thanks, Jamie. Well, I mean, as a policymaker and as somebody who represents Brooklyn in the state legislature, I have families every single day, some very well resourced and in public school settings that, you know, people try to buy $1 million homes to get into, and others who are recent immigrants and who may,
Mhm.
you know, speak another language other than English at home, having the exact same problem that, you know, too often at our schools, when reading issues present themselves, there are other justifications made for children, even though the research tells us clearly that they present themselves and they persist. You know, I was lucky enough when I went to PS 230 in Brooklyn that I had a teacher who was completely honest and straight with my parents at the first grade that I could not read at all. She
Yeah.
did not wish it away. She did not claim I was a boy or I was young for my age or come up with some other justification. And I think that as policymakers, you know, I think we all know that, you know, there's no magic bullet screener and
Mhm.
resources are finite. You know, we're not going to be able to get every child to have a neuropsych, nor would we want them to be. But I think we need to make sure that we set in place both in law and through chancellors and superintendents and school principals a fidelity to be honest about what are the real benchmarks around literacy, what happens when children are not meeting those benchmarks. And some of them are neurobiological in origin, others may be structural or environmental, and sometimes they're all three. And making sure that we're actually meeting the needs of those children. And you know, the legislation that I have, whether it be the New York with Individuals with Dyslexia Education Act, the Right to Read Act, the Dyslexia Task Force, or the New York Dyslexia Diagnosis Act, they really all have the exact same spirit, which is making sure that we prioritize early childhood literacy in kindergarten through 5th grade, because that is the magic skill, right?
Yeah.
We know that all of the negative outcomes come from children not being able to read. And we know that we stunt the potential of children in so many ways when they don't become strong readers. And we know that remediating reading becomes significantly easier when it's caught in 1st or 2nd grade, and we don't allow children to fail completely and then try to remediate the issue
Yeah.
in 4th, 5th, 6th, or 7th grade. And that's what we're trying to do. It is a huge task in a diverse system and a giant system like the New York City public school system. But it's actually a very well-resourced system, New York City public schools. And so I am hopeful that we are able to create scalable models and provide good public policy, because the fear in New York City and in New York State is that right now we have no laws on the books that actually protect children when it comes to for diagnosis, for proper supports and interventions. And if we have a change in who the governor or mayor or who a specific chancellor is, suddenly policy can change completely. And that's why we're so, in my office, focused on putting in some real guardrails and protections legally here in New York State for children. And unfortunately, New York State probably ranks last right now when it comes to good, thoughtful legislation around making sure children can learn how to read.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I so appreciate that. You know, I sometimes joke that I'm a recovering school psychologist. So I spent some years in public school evaluating kids, trying to be on the right side of that conversation, right? Really leaning into helping kids, not trying to see myself as a barrier of special education services, but really an advocate for children. And some of the challenges when you see even like communicating with a school-based evaluation or districts who really get a little bit less excited to read an outside professional's evaluation, or even for families to understand how to go about getting an evaluation in the process of that, and what's the role of good screeners. We have such a long way to go, and I really hope that we're able to kind of get some legislative pieces on the plate that really help families navigate that. And I just so applaud the work that you're doing to really level that playing field around that here in New York State. So it's deeply, deeply important. The other thing that we talk about here a lot, and I've had parents who've asked the question and community folks who ask the question, and we are a little different from some schools like ours, where we don't say the term learning difference. And I know that's often a softer term, and it's one that sort of gets kids to feel a little bit better about what's happening. And I think there's the worry that our kid's going to feel bad because we use the word disability. And I think that for my experience, one, we have to call it what it is. I think we have to use language, and our language is important. And when we as adults are afraid to say things, I think kids pick up on the fact that this might be scary, right? And you don't go to the doctor and have a diagnosis and say, well, you have a sugar irregularity. No, you probably got diabetes, right? Like you've got a disorder here, and there's some things to manage this. And so if we don't call it what it is, if we don't name it, I think it can feel a little scary for folks sometimes. And so we just want to make sure that we always do that. So we use disability with a great deal of intentionality in that. But I've also seen places where in schools, and again, I'm not trying to pick on schools, but I happen to work in one, so I feel like I've got a little bit of a ability to make this statement. But I've seen, out in schools where the idea of a difference gets kind of weaponized a little bit. Because if I say we're all neurodivergent, we're all a little different, and so everybody's got a little something that they need, that lowers the urgency for a school district to do anything about that differently. And it says, oh, just part of the natural fabric. So I'm going to go back to doing my thing. You go back to doing your thing as a student, and we're all going to be fine. Which the reality, we know that's just not where the world lives, right? So which is why, I have been, really thinking and talking and really trying to kind of, share with families that perspective. And I also think from a child's perspective, the idea of kind of calling it and knowing a little bit more about it, demystifying that concept of a learning disability is one of the most empowering things you can do. And so really gives kids a chance to define that for themselves and not letting this thing define them in that way. But also recognizing that it's, like you are a perfectly capable human being who is going to do off and do great things. We need to make sure that you get the right instruction to help you learn to read effectively. Therein lies the demystification. And I think that we need to really spend some time really pushing that, which is also why I think the idea of, how we come to the table to really sort of credential and certify and license our teachers. And so, maybe Jackie, if you could, because I know you've spent a lot of time, not only in CLE, but like in your sort of your past life, really thinking about this idea of licensure and teacher training. Like what needs to happen in that space? I know Bobby's laid out some nice things in the, so you feel free to pound your fist on this one if you'd like.
I have a soapbox that we could take down a rabbit hole so far. We'd be here, let me first start by saying thank you. And we agree with you, Jamie, around disability. And I say that wholeheartedly with the backing of, Margie mentioned our Young Adult Leadership Council. They are 18 to sometimes 30-year-olds who are either in post-secondary settings, they're in employment settings, and they have said to us now, time and time again, we are disabled. That's who we are. We have appropriated the term. It's important for us to recognize that this is not an acute issue. This is not going away, and that we are proud to be who we are, and we know what we need, and therefore we will advocate on that end. So 100%, you've got our full support around the destigmatizing of the disability language. So when it comes to teacher licensure, some of you may know already, I used to be a university professor, and I used to, in that same vein, I was an educator preparer. And most of my time was actually spent educating and preparing general educators to meet the needs of kids within the special education system, because all of those students were in their classrooms. And the intention there was to always collaborate with special educators in the classroom so that they started off from the very, very initial stages of preparation, recognizing that collaboration is the #1 key to ensuring kids with services get not only what they need, but have the long-standing supports and see themselves as self-advocates in the class. I think the dilemma within the licensure system and the certification programs is manifold. I'll highlight a few, and then I'll tell you, if I ruled the world, what would I do? So on the one hand, we're stuck in this very arcane version of 4-year universities, where in many cases, kids are getting 2 years of preparation and then 2 years in their content and or in their degree area. And so we're not even seeing as many people going into education first and foremost. And those that aren't going into the specialties that we need. And so we have huge teacher shortages. In addition to that, we've seen states across the country lower the standards for entry into the profession by virtue of either not requiring a master's degree any longer because nobody was getting them, And so they decided, let's just give it a bachelor's degree and you can enter the profession as a teacher. And then after that, barring all the shortages, we saw them lower it even further by saying, we don't have enough professionals, so let's deprofessionalize this industry and say anybody 18 to 22 who served 24 months in the military can now become a certified teacher in Florida. So for me, there are huge ramifications, not just for general educators, but especially for kids with learning disabilities who are in the gen ed classroom when they don't have a professional ready educator at the helm, right, of the ship. In addition to that, we're seeing kids who are going into education professions walking out of degree programs with 2 and 3 times the debt that they have with peers in comparison, simply because business majors, those who are pre-law, pre-med, and other industries, the starting salaries are just so much higher. They can afford to take on the level of debt in undergrad, whereas a teacher cannot. So all of that being said, I would love to see the federal government, and I'm hoping that my colleagues in the department are hearing this, say to the entire country, teaching is a civil service. It should be something that people enter without debt, that they walk out of with 6 years of engagement, 2 of those years being within an apprenticeship model where they are residents in classrooms and they're with master teachers, and they simply relinquish the reins over the course of time, but they do not do so until they're absolutely ready. And that there's no expectation that they walk in on day 1 with everything they're supposed to know and feel and be able to do at competency, because it's impossible to ask that of people. We don't ask that of doctors, and teaching is just as credible profession. So that's what I would do to change things.
Yeah, and I have been singing your song on that one. That's like, you and I have such synergy on that space right there. Like it, but the economic engine that Department of Educations have for their institutions and their universities, I think we have to unravel that, right? Because I think some of those are like the licensure programs for masters are one of the biggest money makers in outside of like the football program often for colleges. And so I think you're absolutely right. No one should, if who wants to be a teacher, should have any debt to that pathway. You know, there should be some federal subsidies, state subsidies to make that happen. And I love, which is the model we use here, that apprentice model, where we have a teacher in residence. You come in as a teacher. Doesn't matter where you went to school, doesn't matter how much experience you have. We're going to say you're amazing, but guess where you're starting? You're going to be watching a master teacher. You're going to be going to class on Tuesday afternoons for 2 hours. You're going to be observed as you start to get little incremental moments of control in the classroom before we ever set you in front, because we want to make sure that whoever's in front of our kids are the absolute best trained human beings we can possibly put in front of kids. So you've got an ally in that work. So I cannot wait. I cannot wait to see that world that you just painted come to fruition. So thank you so much for that. You know, and when we think about this idea of the teacher training, I think that a lot of folks come out of these university programs hoping, and I'm going to sort of pick on, I've got a cousin who's a teacher who I love and adore, and, you know, she's an elementary school teacher. And I think she's talked about, like, no one's ever told me this stuff. Like, I think so many people come out of a university and they think someone's going to train me eventually on how to teach kids how to read if I'm teaching first, second, third graders, right? And the reality is no one does. And you get there and you're like, okay, well, they bought the program here. I've got these things in front. No one trained me even how to use the program they bought. So I'm going to use it. I want to implement that with probably a shadow of fidelity. And if there are things in there that are not research-based, often I don't even know that I'm doing these things that are, like, I hate to say this, put this frame on, but actually harmful to kids, right? I mean, you're doing harm educationally. And we know, like, there's been a pill that New York City, I think, swallowed a long time ago from the Teachers College that has been put this program in the hands of so many schools across New York City and across the country, and has really done some detrimental work, where you have kids doing things like, look at the first letter. Why don't you guess? You know, look at the context clues, look at the pictures, try to figure out what that word could be. That's what poor readers do. And we're training kids who are very capable. And so I can get on a little bit of a curriculum sort of, you know, been there, but how do we start to address the curriculum work that needs to happen in the classrooms to bring truly, like, good sort of materials, good training to folks in the classroom who are already there?
If you don't mind, I'm going to start simply because I feel like I have something to share, and then
Yeah,
I think
please.
Margie probably wants to jump right in. What I didn't indicate earlier, and I feel like this is my opportunity to say my piece, is I really believe in dual licensure programs. I believe that every teacher should be certified in both general ed, special ed, and English language learning. And I think walking into classrooms, every educator should have that opportunity, and not in 4 years, which is why the mentorship and the master teaching model is so important. We saw great gains when we had even co-teaching faculty working with pre-service teachers. So you would have general ed pre-service teachers, special ed pre-service teachers combined in classrooms, talking about the exact same curriculum, and essentially organically, but yet intentionally creating that level of collaboration and communication before they even walked into a school system. Those kinds of models exist. They should be proliferated. And that's one way of ensuring that there's content knowledge. There's also expertise and skills, and that we're all talking about the same types of interventions and supports. And there's an expectation that while we may not all know how to employ those same interventions, you know who to go to for those particular pieces. And I'll simply kind of bow this up by saying it is, I think, vitally important that every primary school, wherever your state is with regard to the licensure process, where it's K4, K5, or K6, every primary school teacher should have an entire course lineup of reading instruction. You should be a reading teacher first. And then you should be a general educator with all the accoutrements that come with it, because we know in K6 is where the undergirding of all the reading instruction begins. And if you don't have that kind of content knowledge, you can't prepare kids for middle and high school content level reading.
Yeah, thank you. Could not agree more. I don't know if Margie, if you had anything to add to that.
You know, I'm listening to all of it and it all sounds wonderful. And then I'm thinking about myself as a parent and how do I, if I don't know how to do it, how do I ever begin to navigate and advocate and make sure that my child is getting the right kind of reading instruction? So, you know, we need to train the teachers, but I think we also need to help the parents just as much so that they learn how to ask the right questions and insist, because you have some kind of reading issue does not mean that you shouldn't be treated like everyone else and deserve to get the right kind of help. So, you know, I'm listening to all of this. I'm going, boy, that's great, but wow. You know, steep hill to climb.
Yeah, and I so appreciate you bringing that up, because I think the idea of parent education on this side, you know, again, like, you know, we're in a space where we have so much information at our fingertips. Like, you know, as a parent and walking in this situation, I could actually do some homework, some research. Now, the question is, do I understand the quality of where that's coming from? Do I know the difference between a summary in Ed Weekly versus actual like empirical research? And do I understand enough about empirical research to know whether that may or may not be the right sort of space here, right? So I think there's a lot of things we could do from the policy side, from the teacher training side, from the parent education side of this to help kind of move this along. And I so appreciate that you brought that into the conversation. You know, Bobby, I want to sort of transition just for a moment here, because I do think there's some real legislative action needed. And so you've been doing this work. You have been such a martyr for our kids, such a really a force of good in this work here, especially in the New York State Assembly. From your vantage point right now, what are the missing pieces legislatively that we really need on the table and in action and funded to start to, so the terrible F word in legislative pieces here, you got to actually put some money behind things sometimes. What do you think some of those things are missing right now?
Well, you know, first thing, the state education department in New York, which is run by Chancellor Betty Rosa, you know, has decided to have a kind of see no evil, hear no evil approach, that they say, well, New York is a local control state, and how dare the state regents get involved, or the state legislature, in what's going on in local classrooms. This is an utter canard. And I actually told this to Betty at a hearing last year. I said, you know, if they were teaching creationism at a school in Buffalo or Rochester or Scarsdale, would you say the same thing? And of course she wouldn't. What we desperately need is honesty from our leaders, both on the state level and the local level, because that's where almost all education policy really is done. You know, I have 4 bills, and I don't need to go through all the merits of all of them, but you know, what they at their foundation do is require for evidence-based curriculum for the state education department to release a list of evidence-based literacy curriculum, to set a clear 50-hour standard in evidence-based teacher training, to create a standard for screening children who are exhibiting signs of reading failure and characteristics of dyslexia. You know, these are the kinds of things that can undergird a local school district to make sure that they are doing very specific things so that parents can make interventions. Because I think, as Margie was saying, you know, so many parents are lost, right? They are not expert educators. They expect that their child is going to learn the most foundational skill, reading, when they go to kindergarten, 1st and 2nd grade. And there is deep shame and resentment towards so many parents who then ask questions, who go out and say, just a second, my son or daughter isn't reading. Why aren't they reading? And that's why it's so important to give you know, children and parents these resources. One of the bills I have just requires the state education department to produce a booklet that lays out what rights children and parents have, and actually defining these terms. I don't want to go back in what we were talking before. I'm a person who you will never hear come out of my mouth the term learning disability, not because I'm not afraid to use it, but because I don't believe it is specific, right? There are way too many generic terms that are used, and parents then, they're used as catch-alls. You, Jamie, you, Jackie, may use them in very specific ways, but most school administrators, most parents use these terms in very, very generic ways. And we need to define terms so that parents understand that there are practical ways to provide remediation. And that's the reason why there's lots of reticence towards terms like that. And that's the reason why also schools are then able to hide behind failed policies, because they go and say, they trick the parents into thinking that they're on their side. It's not that they're against them, but that they then, you know, are able to use the lie of all children learn differently. There are late bloomers. There are these kinds of things. Instead of being able to say, I can specifically define dyslexia, these are the characteristics of children with dyslexia, and these are the evidence-based ways to remediate dyslexia or dysgraphia, you know, or, you know, fill in the blank. And I think that we need to do that. I think actually, even though it's a very, very different thing, the autism community has done a much better job of defining autism, of coming with actual legislation to require interventions by states and localities. And I think we could learn a lot from them. You know, New York State has laws on the books to actually intervene for children with autism. We don't have laws on the books that really help and support children struggling with dyslexia.
Thank you. I think I think it's a great segue, Bobby. So Margie, I want to throw this one over to you, because I think, given your marketing communications background, I'd like to think this is a really solid question in your camp here. Do you think that we've got a PR problem when it comes to dyslexia? I've had some So
you want me to?
I would love.
Yeah.
How do we improve the messaging there?
Well, so first of all, dyslexia is a really, really hard word. Learning disabilities is a hard word, and we don't have any central voice, any clear voice that has clear messaging about what action we want people to take and what it is, what the problem is. So that's number one. Number two is we are invisible. In other words, you can't, it's not like a disease that you can see. So sympathy for us is hard to generate, and it's hard to fundraise for. And it's particularly hard because we talk in words, we don't tell stories, and we need to tell stories that make what we are dealing with very human. So making people and you know, using kids, teachers, whatever we need to do to really bring those stories alive. So the best thing our community could would be to get together, to really think through define what is really the communications problem, and then agree to talk with one voice. And, you know, autism has done this brilliantly, and they also have had the funding to do it brilliantly. You know, it just doesn't happen. So, and I could go on for hours about this.
No, I love your focus on the story, and, you know, and maybe, as you think about, so I want to kind of keep, if you don't mind, I like to kind of keep this question directed towards you, because I think from a parent perspective, and Bobby, feel free, I'd love to get your thoughts as actually a student coming through this work here. But what, you know, as a parent of a student with dyslexia, what are some things and thoughts that you have about how families can help communicate and advocate for their needs in these spaces with public school districts or independent school districts that they're working through? Like, do you have any tips or thoughts for the parents in that space to help navigate that a little bit more easily?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, for one is, I think that parents the first thing is to get parents to accept the fact that their kid might have a problem, right? So and that's hard to do. You know, I mean, a lot of parents just want to go, and then if they do have the problem, they're trying to figure out, oh my gosh, what does this really mean? So one of the things that I think would be helpful is to really have some tools available for parents, and even some language that they could use to talk to teachers and administrators that would get the ball rolling. I remember when my own daughter, Julie, we were at a private school in 6th grade, and we were just told, she's not going to make it here.
Yeah.
She's not going to make it here. I didn't have any tools to say, hey, wait a second, where are all the resources? You know, don't we deserve X, Y, and Z? They just were not interested. And it was interesting. They said this to two of us, one in separate conferences, my daughter and another young woman. And, you know, thank goodness we went to Windward. So, I mean, we were so lucky. And so today, those two kids, where are those two kids today? My daughter's a legal aid lawyer, and the other kid is the sports medicine doctor. So, I mean, come on. So I think about, I'm really not answering your question well, but I really believe that if we could equip parents with feeling of power, which is hard to have, that they really deserve this, that their kids deserve it. And that even if we could create communities where parents could get together, even online, you know, there are all these groups online that we really should be tapping into and using.
Yeah. I think there's a grassroots organizational philosophy that we should really be thinking through in that process.
And that's part of the communications as well. I mean, you cannot do this, right? You know, I always say on land, you have to do it on sea too, and in online.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Bobby, anything from your perspective as a student that you feel like, from the idea of like how to really empower and help kids advocate for themselves, even, or as parents?
Well, look, I think that Margie is right, that, you know, we need to show parents first that, look, I think acceptance is a big thing. I think that we have lots and lots of parents, we have lots and lots of teachers who are resistant to a label, resistant to anything that they don't see as normative. And I think that that kind of honesty is desperately needed. I think when it comes to and let me talk about policymakers for a second, then I'll talk about myself. You know, I think we also, though, you know, people, we were talking about that words are important. I really do believe that words are important. And, you know, we've got people in real power, governors, mayors, school superintendents, who love to use a phrase like equity constantly, that they believe in equity, they believe in justice. You don't believe in equity, you don't believe in justice if you don't believe in teaching children how to read, full stop. Okay. And 90% of children at Rochester public schools read below grade level, and over 50% can't read at all. And that's in 5th grade. Okay, so I don't want to hear from the governor or from the school's chancellor that they believe in these things. I go to their speeches all the time. I don't believe them. And I think
Yeah.
what we need to make sure is that we, both students and parents, call them on it.
Yeah.
And I think it's really, really important. I think that our children, and I think about my own son, and knowing the struggles I went through and feeling the alienation that I felt. You know, I was the only kid from Brooklyn who went to Windward when I went to Windward. I was I was one of only 2 kids who went to the Gateway School who were from Brooklyn when the Gateway School was 30 kids. I remember very, very well lying to children when I was 7, 8, 9, 10 years old about where I went to school and why I didn't go to school in the neighborhood I lived in Brooklyn. And so I think making sure that our children feel confident and understand that, you know, this does not define them, that this is going to be a struggle and something that they're going to have to work on. And then also understanding that it is okay to advocate for oneself. And it's okay to say, just a second, I want something different. You know, the kind of great thing about America is, you know, every July 4th, we celebrate our independence. But then when we send our children to school, we ask them to be all identical and to speak up. And I think that, you know, we've done a really, really good job since I was a kid of celebrating, you know, those differences and allowing kids more space. But of course, I don't want to forget the point that there's a long way to go. The sad thing is, if my son went to a local public school down the block like I did 30 plus years later, and he was struggling with dyslexia like I did, the exact same thing would probably happen. That I would have to go and sue the New York City Department of Education and send him to a place like Windward or Churchill or Gateway. That is unconscionable. And so I really do hope that parents and people who care about literacy actually hold politicians, superintendents accountable for their glib uncaringness around literacy. It's the only skill. As somebody who, you know, struggled to learn to read, but then learned to read and was able to get a law degree, I understand how difficult that struggle is. I think there are way too many people in power who have a cruel indifference to it. And, you know, we really need to hold them account.
You know, don't get me started on the empathy gap that we have in this world. Like one's individual experience is applied to everybody, and I think people have a hard time. I've talked to so many superintendents who will say things like, well, it's only like 10% of our kids, we're fine. And the reality is they forget how important of a critical skill that is. And I think you're right about the equity, Bobby. I think you are so right on there, is that this is the thing that levels kids up. This allows them to access a greater potential and opportunity than they're currently in. And I think we have so much work to do to get to change that sort of rhetoric around that. So I so appreciate everything you're doing. I know we're going to take some questions, but as I've taken some notes here, so forgive me. You know, we have had such a great conversation about, you know, recognizing that parent journey, the challenges in that identification, the struggles around acknowledging. Sometimes I talked to 2 parents last night who, you know, were of one child who were both on opposite ends of that spectrum. One was he's going to be fine. The other one's he needs some real help here. And even the dilemmas that can be faced within a family around recognizing this, not to mention just navigating the incredible sea of challenge when it comes to finding the right resources for your child and knowing as a parent when to ask, what to ask for. I love, Jackie. I feel like I'm on board. If we want to start the national tour about sort of getting some massive changes and rethinking how we come to the table around education and what needs to happen and how undergraduate teacher prep needs to happen. I think you painted a vision that I am 1,000,000% behind. And if I were to wake up tomorrow and have a wish, you know, it wouldn't be for millions of dollars, it'd actually be for that, because I think that would be such a transformational force in our world. I also know that we need some deep translational work here, from research to the classroom, and how we bridge that gap in a way that really I think honors teachers' expertise and allows them to really contribute at a high level, and also have a better understanding of what, be a little bit more data literate and research literate in the process of this. And then, Margie, I'm also, you know, thinking about your sort of comment around what kids get when they come to a space like Windward or the Gaynor School or Churchill or Gateway. I recently had a superintendent, this was a shadow of conversations. We had somebody in a meeting with a superintendent who said, they called Windward, this was segregation of kids with disabilities. And I was like, I am so sorry. That is such an ignorant statement. And I'm using that word very intentionally here. This is just utter ignorance. And the reality is that when kids are in a space where they're seen, where they're valued, where they're heard, where they're felt as if they actually have so much to contribute, and we see all the great things and we encourage them to move under their own power, there is a transformational thing that happens. We have great research informing our instructional practices. We have an incredible level of fidelity and integrity of program from the research and what it's supposed to be to how it's implemented in our classrooms, which really allows us to do great work. But it's the culture and the environment with which our kids receive that instruction that I think is truly what allows all that to kind of bring that together. Sometimes I joke, like my experience in school down in Eastern Kentucky was not one of loving education. It was one of fighting every step of the way to kind of go through a program that didn't feel like it wanted me there, right? Or like I was actually a partner in that process. I was something being acted on, not acted with, right? And I really want our educators here to understand that every child who walks in our door has a tremendous amount of strength. And we do work so hard to really validate, to help the kids see that, and to help them walk a path where they get to put some really good effort in, and they get to see the results of that energy and effort. And so, and that's where I think like schools like ours are places that really value, and not just, I think there's some other schools that do model that the models a little differently, that are able to bring kids to a great space. But when you have these specialty schools, I think we do something that sometimes public schools can't do in a way that they aren't able to do, or haven't been, and I'm going to say this, but because I worked in the public school for a number of years, haven't been creative enough with the resource they have. Sometimes it's about how they're using their time and their resources more than about the lack of resource. But I so appreciate the conversation today. I think we're going to take a few questions. So I'm going to pop open the question thing here. And we've got a couple actually really good ones right out of the gate here. So one, and I may try to take a chance on this one here, but it said, would you say there are whole group instructional methods that can and do meet the needs of dyslexic students if one-to-one interventions are not available? So I think this is a wonderful question. And I think sometimes we get a little bit confused in this because schools will say, well, we don't have the resources to do one-to-one. That's all you need. That is, we don't do one-to-one intervention here at Windward. That's not our model at all. Actually, a well-designed, homogeneously grouped skill group for kids focused on the same set of skills can really do tremendous work. And most schools like ours actually employ a small group model, or I would say small group, like anywhere from 6 to 10, maybe 12 kids in a classroom, or a group kind of working through a similar set of skills. So there's actually a lot of spaces. That's why I had said earlier about the idea of public schools using their resource a little bit differently. But when you're in a classroom in second grade as a teacher, and you've got 32 kids in that classroom, which is not uncommon across the maybe 28 to 32, let's just put that range in there. At second grade, you'll have kids who are comprehending and reading maybe even like a 6th grade level, and you'll have kids who are non-readers. And you as a teacher have to differentiate that sort of like that massive chasm of challenge. That's a space where, if that's the model where you're in your only option, you're probably going to have to do some really small groups to be able to get targeted in that space. But I do think there's a lot of spaces where you can do small group instruction and small group intervention work to actually get at this issue and be able to have kids have a lot of impact from that work. It's really about how you create the groupings and the instructional materials you're bringing to that conversation. So great question. Thank you so much for that. And happy to, if anybody else has any other thoughts about that, happy to entertain that. The next question, I'm really liking this one, and I may actually sort of lob this one up here to Bobby, because I think in New York City, this has been one of the most interesting things about how New York City and the accountability and the reimbursement. So let's talk a bit about accountability and prohibiting more funds from being spent to fight parents seeking reimbursement than the education would cost. We see this in Westchester. We see this in the city. Sometimes the districts will spend so much on attorney fees to avoid paying out a settlement for families who are seeking reimbursement. And so it's just like, it's like spending good, spending bad over good, right? Like they're creating a space where they're spending more money than there are. So Bobby, I'd love to talk about how do we hold districts accountable for that side of it.
It's so true, and it's they use it also as a way to chill working class and middle class parents from actually going out and seeking rights. They see how hard fought it is, and so they hope that they'll dissuade them, more parents, from pursuing the mandated services that their children are entitled to via federal law. Mayor de Blasio, in the prior administration in New York City, actually did quite a good thing and decided to not be nearly as litigious as both his predecessor and his successor have been. And we desperately need to come up with a way that allows for there to be controls in the system to maybe stop true abuse, but for children and families asserting their civil rights, and a free, appropriate public education is a civil right for children with disabilities, right? And that is clear. And so, it also, I can tell you as a person who struggled with dyslexia, as a parent, and as a person who represents a lot of parents, I think the vast majority of parents go to litigation as a last resort. It means that they have not gotten any services that are worthwhile at their local school, and that if we actually focused on providing real interventions to children at their local public school, these lawsuits would dry up. They may not disappear, but they would dry up significantly. It's the fact that parents have finally been empowered and have been educated that more and more parents have been using the legal system to assert their rights. And again, I do believe that this is a civil rights issue. Nowhere else would people ever suggest that parents asserting their children's civil rights should be dissuaded. It's that we need our school systems and our elected leaders to act better, and that only comes from advocacy, unfortunately. And hopefully that will change. And I do think that we're seeing some small progress made in New York State and some real progress in other states over the last number of years.
And maybe to build on that question a little bit, because we got another question about the legislative pieces around this legal fees. Has there been any thought to how to help families who may? I do think there's an equity issue in this conversation here, especially in New York City, around the process, which how parents sue the district to seek reimbursement for outside services. Sometimes is that it is very much a pay to play, right? So you have to outlay money for the attorney, outlay money for the neuropsych, and then you march down and you do your work, and then hopefully you get some reimbursement from the city at times. So is there anything that can be done legislatively to help families monetarily assist families in the process with legal fees and testing?
Sure. So we have a bill that actually passed unanimously last year in the Assembly, but was never brought to the floor in the Senate, and that's A 2898, and we call it the Dyslexia Diagnosis Act. Now, of course, what it really does is require private insurance companies to pay for neuropsychological evaluations, and that doesn't just have to be for dyslexia; it could be for dysgraphia or other learning issues. And we think that a bill like this, and there's some questions, insurance companies would fight it on a whole host of issues, but we believe we are in the right, and the state has the authority to mandate private insurance, not Medicaid, but to mandate private insurance to pay for most, if not all, the cost of neuropsychological evaluations. And if we were able to do that, that would be a huge step in at least giving all parents or most parents access to this necessary resource. Lawyers' fees and the kind of litigious nature that New York City and New York State have gone down, obviously, we really can't legislate that, but we, of course, can really try to legislate all the other things, the upstream methods of making our schools better, which would stop the litigation. And look, again, as a person who has had more neuropsychs than I'd like to count, because, you know, there are lots of accommodations that one will need. I'm a big advocate for untiming tests for all, but if you're a person who struggled with dyslexia, it's a really important thing. I'm a true progressive, and so I believe in progressive education for all and people dictating their education needs. But if you want to advocate for yourself not to be required to take, Spanish 1, 2, and 3, a neuropsych is going to be an important thing to have. And so, that bill, I really do think we have movement to get done this year. And I hope if we have New Yorkers on, that they'll advocate to their assembly member and their state senator to support that bill and to get it done.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Kind of last question here we've gotten here, unless another one pops up in the meantime here. It's really about understanding the policy need to kind of call dyslexia a disorder, disability versus as opposed to a difference. And we've got the question here is, how do you balance that with a countervailing need to teach dyslexic students in the world at large about the ways dyslexic brains are special and advantageous? This is a particularly interesting question to me, and I'd love to maybe take the first part here, and Jackie, I would love to maybe see if you have any additional thoughts on this one. I find this question to be one of the most interesting questions, and it's one that I sometimes come into a little bit of conflict with, and I want to be really open and honest about that conflict. Is because one is that I think we all have strengths, and I want to make sure that we always recognize that we all have strengths. And I have had people say, well, the vast majority of CEOs in these big companies are dyslexic. And I'm like, yeah, there is a correlation there, right? Some of those folks are. But for every person who's a CEO, I can point to 500 people who never made it out of prison because of the situation that they're in. So I have a really hard time saying this is like, this gives you the ability to see patterns in the world that no one else can see. I struggle with that language sometimes because I do think it's at times can minimize. And there's actually I've not seen the research yet. I know there's been some small studies where people have kind of pulled out some of these things, but the real sort of research there is, for me, is still a little bit lacking. However, I do think that we all have a lot of strengths. We all have our own sort of individual sort of profile and panel of strengths. And I think making sure that we don't forget to have our students lead with their strengths. We have some kids who are exceptional at reading the room and sort of navigating the EQ part of a conversation. We have just as many kids, if not more, who struggle from that sometimes, reading the room in that way. We have some kids who use spoken language to an incredible degree. We have some kids who struggle with spoken language. But if I were to come back to, I was on a podcast with this guy who's really is entrepreneurial. I love this guy, so much great energy a few years ago. And he asked me this question. And I said, if I had to pick one thing that I believe dyslexic students get from a strength perspective out of this process, and that's actually the one of resilience. Because I think our kids have had so many moments where they've had to hit the wall. And there's a lot of folks in this world who they don't get a chance to ever struggle or hit a wall. And I think there's a gift in that. And I know sometimes for our kids, it doesn't feel like a gift, but I do believe the idea of learning to persevere when things get hard is one of the most important gifts that our kids can get. Because they see themselves as actually having agency. They see themselves as having value in this space. And they know when something doesn't work well, that their energies and their efforts can really create change. And I think that idea of being resilient, getting up, rethinking, what did I do? What can I do differently? How can I grow from this experience? How can I reflect a little bit? That is such an incredible gift. And I think that's where, and I think if you maybe do the scratch and sniff on the CEO pathway, I think that's actually some of their gift as well. It's not the seeing the patterns necessarily. It's really about persevering when things get hard and knowing that and expecting the world to get a little hard sometimes and having you work through it. So, because I've heard people say, well, dyslexics are more creative. Creativity is actually normally distributed amongst the population, and it doesn't sort of reside. My wife's a high school art teacher, and she would have kids in her classroom who had dyslexic, have amazing spatial skills. And then 2 other kids who had almost no spatial skills to kind of work through that process with. So I do think that I worry sometimes when we do this, and I know it's designed to actually have a heart for kids. And I hope folks don't hear me as not having a heart for kids. That is the opposite of what I would want to communicate here. Because I have a lot of heart for our kids in this space. But I also know that we want to make sure we empower them with the right language, with the right tools, with the right information, to understand that they are really fantastic people. They all have a unique fingerprint of strengths to bring to the table. And I want them to help them identify those and really leverage and build on those. And so yeah, so that's my 2.5 cents. But I'd love to hear from your perspective, Jackie, what you think.
I'm really glad you started off because you spoke what I was thinking out loud. And so I don't want to move away from what you've just noted. I think I have deep conflict with this question and have heard from our young adult leaders around their own conflicts with this question. So let me just add maybe a few examples to help others better situate themselves. So one of our young adult leaders who sits on our board of directors. So we have a YALC member that will sit with our board of directors and participate in direction setting for the organization, reminded me in a conversation months ago that it's not her job to be somebody else's inspiration, that disability is a disability, and that it's not acute, it's long-term, and that there are struggles that come with having a learning disability alongside other disabilities. And that just because she is in a doctoral program doesn't mean that her story is meant to diminish, to your point, other people's stories who are not able to be in doctoral programs. Yeah. And I think that segues nicely into what you mentioned around ensuring that kids do have that sense of grit and persistence, and they understand what resilience looks like. I really believe that has to be cultivated. That yes, that is the case, and that many of those CEOs would argue that's what they bring to the table foremost than others. But for all those people that aren't in that position, that resiliency may not have been cultivated because of their life circumstances, their family, the school environment. And it is our job, it is our duty to our students to remind them at every moment where they're struggling that this indeed sucks. It's terrible. It's not fun. I get it. I'm really proud of you for persisting and using that kind of language to remind them that is an asset that they bring to the table, unique to others. Yeah. And then the last thing I think I'll just mention is, in addition to the persistence and resilience characteristics, I would say I think Bobby said it earlier, it's only in school systems that we expect students to be normative. I would say where we expect students to be perfect. They're supposed to get A's in every single subject. No adult expects that of themselves. No adult walks into a room and says, I could be any one of these industry professionals. We all have self-selected into the area of our own interest and expertise. And that's something I think that our kids bring to the table. They know themselves and they know what they like and what they want to be doing and what's difficult for them and whether or not that's something they want to continue doing. And so I argue that's another asset that I think we should highlight for our kids.
Love that. Thank you.
Can I jump in there and just say that we also don't need it to be self-defining. I think that this question, as somebody who struggled with dyslexia, this is a question that parents ask, I think most of all, because parents are concerned. Parents love their children and they desperately want them to be happy and successful. I don't define myself through the struggles that I had and struggles I may still have. And I think that, we don't ask other people, because it's neurobiological in origin, and we decide that that is wrapped up with our entire identity. We don't ask other people who have struggles or disabilities to define themselves purely through that prism at all times. And I think it's exceptionally unfair to define people through that prism, because I agree, there's great diversity in the world and there's great talent in the world. And just because something is connected doesn't mean that it's caused by it, right? It very well could just be a correlation. And I think that, we need to make sure that though we may use some slightly different verbiage, remediating and working to give support to children's issues around dyslexia is what's important. Defining your child, I think, through their dyslexia is not. Dyslexia, at least the studies I've read, is highly hereditary. If my son struggles with dyslexia, one, I don't wish it on him. I don't think it's a magic trick. I don't think you're magical if you're dyslexic. I'm dyslexic and I don't think I'm magical. But if he struggles with that, the thing that I wish I had that I didn't have was that it doesn't become a defining characteristic of your entire childhood. That saps a childhood from a young person. And I think that that's really important. I do think that there are absolutely wonderful things and children and adults who've struggled with dyslexia have succeeded in almost all walks of life. That may or may not, be what your child decides to do, but I think requiring it always to be a definitional characteristic is problematic. And we don't ask that of many other people.
Margie, I'd love to have your thoughts on this as well.
I'm listening, and I'm also thinking that, as a parent, we do not have all the answers, and we cannot give our children all the time. We can try to teach them resilience, we can show them resilience, but we should use the channels around us to help children grow that way. Coaches, church leaders, doctors, anybody who can tell a kid, hey, you are great.
Yeah.
And so, as Bobby says, it's not just being a dyslexic person, it's being a terrific person who has all kinds of great skills. And I think that way kids do begin to learn a little bit about themselves and feel proud of themselves. It's all about feeling good about yourself, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It is. I was talking to Harold Koplowitz down at CMI, this was last year, and he was recounting a story about essentially asking, is dyslexia a gift? And I think I think this was Orlando Bloom who had said this. So forgive me, Orlando, if I get your quote wrong, if this is, not that Orlando's watching this, right? But, I can dream, right? But I think Harold said, is this a gift? And if it was, would you, if seeing it as a gift is one thing, but would you return it if you could? And I think he had said, oh my God, in a heartbeat, I would give this up in a heartbeat if I could, right? Like, so if it's something you'd return as quickly as you got it, it's probably not the thing that is going to define you in that way, right? And so I love coming to the table with a strength-based focus. I love when we get a chance to celebrate those things. And I do think, Jackie, you're right. As adults, we get to move and gravitate into the spaces that we are most confident and comfortable, right? Maybe not comfortable, maybe comfortable is the wrong word, but most confident and feel like we've got the most kind of skill and talent. And that's the beauty of growing up, I think, in so many ways, is we get to lean into that in a way. And we want to make sure our kids understand the full focus of that. So I have to tell you, this has been, for me, I hope you've enjoyed being part of this panel. I have really, really enjoyed your perspectives. I really appreciate your time, your energy, your talents, your intellect, and your thoughts about this work. And also the passion that you've all had in pursuing some real change for kids and who are really struggling with some reading and dyslexia in general, but also just from reading challenges across the board, and being strong advocates for teacher training, for how we're going to approach this on the national scale, and certainly and from a legislative effort, Bobby. I so appreciate all that you all done to really make the lives for our kids a lot better. So thank you for your time today. And I really want to say thank you to all our participants here. I know we're going to make this available on our website for folks who want to review it again. But just want to say a big thank you to all three of you for being part of this, and for everybody showing up today to listen. So thank you so much.